Okay, we're on lesson 24. Woo! I have done a lot of reading today. Before we start reading 24, I need you to add to your theme chart. This is page 430 to page 439. This is where Walter finds Rose, all the way to where he writes her note. I need you to talk about the challenge that Rose is facing, how Rose responds, and what point is the author trying to make. You will also need to fill out what lesson do we learn in the text. And I believe that is all for this one.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, here we go. No cheating. You have to fill that out before you listen to the rest of the story. All right. This is where we left off. Walter asking Rose what happened. The next morning, Ben headed to the wolf diorama. He read the sign on the wall over and over again, trying to make sense of how his dream got here, behind the glass in the museum. He stared at the North Star. He wished that he was with his mom in her library, where everything was safe and numbered and organized by the Dewey Decimal System. Ben wished the world was organized by the Dewey Decimal System. That way you'd be able to find whatever you were looking for, like the meaning of your dream or your dad. If only the card catalog in the hall of filing cabinets wasn't empty. Ben might have been able to look up information about the diorama. And then he remembered the receipt for the golden cup he'd found inside the filing cabinets. What else might be filed away in there? So we see Walter and Rose, and they're walking, and now look, Walter's carrying Rose's suitcase, and they are outside of the museum, so they are headed somewhere together. In a taxi. In New York. This is Times Square area. You can tell by all of the lights and craziness. Over the road to tomorrow. Remember that sometimes these signs tell us clues about what's happening in the story. Victory. Right this way. Lucky girl. Do you see any more, Miss Shirley? Brother's tunic. The Rescue brand dental cream.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. The file stretched from one end of the huge hall to the other. Each drawer had a silver handle and a little framed card indicating what was inside. Ben ran the length of the hallway until he came to the section of files with the letter D. He counted and was amazed that there were 58 different drawers, all labeled dioramas. One by one, he opened and found hanging files stuffed with papers and photographs, legal pads, and notes. There seemed to be files for every single diorama in the entire museum, but nothing labeled Gunflint Lake. There were no files for wolves either. He tried Minnesota and night before figuring out they were organized by halls. He found a little tab with the word Hall of North American Mammals typed on a small white card. He flipped past labels labeled, he flipped past, I lost my spot.
Files. Go down. Down. Right
There we go. He flipped past files labeled Alaska Brown Bear, Canoe Bay, Alaska Peninsula, Jaguar, Box Canyon, near Guaymas, Western Sonora, Mexico, and Wapiti, Wapiti, Trappers Lake Basin, Horseshoe Range, Colorado, and finally he came to Wolf, Gunflint Lake, Minnesota. There were 4 files with that title. Ben took a deep breath and he opened them. In the first file, he saw beautiful photographs of birds, animals, and trees that he knew well, like the black-billed cuckoos, gulls, raccoons, otters, aspen, white spruce, and birch. Most were black and white, but a few were in color. There were photos of the arching sky and the Gunflint stones, and wide expanses of snow. Some pictures were out of focus, and few had arrows and circles drawn on them with a pen. On the bottom of most of the photos, it said 1965. In the second file, Ben found drawings of Gunflint Lake. There were pictures of trees and the lake he'd left behind and every square inch of the property all around his house, as well as the sky at day and night and the phases of the moon. The drawings were done in pencil or charcoal, and the lines were swift and bold. Ben saw a sketch that he recognized immediately as the cabin on his family's property, and he shivered. The third file was filled with hundreds of sketches of wolves in every possible position. Ben marveled at the way they ran and sat and jumped across the pages. Their eyes were bright with intelligence, and he could almost feel the muscles beneath their fur. The fourth file contained legal papers, contracts, letters, receipts, charts, and tickets. A little slip of paper folded in half was wedged in the bottom of the file. He unfolded it and saw that it was a receipt. The purple ink was fading, but he could read the date, 1969. What do we remember about the date 1969? It was on that bookmark. It is also the year that Ben was born. On the back was a handwritten note in black ink. Dinner tomorrow. Meet at Kincaid's, 8 p.m. Love, M. There's M again. Who is M? Kincaid's, M. Ben felt the faint ripple of electricity rush across the surface of his skin. Was this the same Kincaid's he'd been looking for? And was this the same M who'd written the note inside Wonderstruck? A shadow stretching across the files at the end of the hallway caught Ben's attention. Someone was coming. Ben panicked and grabbed the files. Stealing them was easier than he would have guessed. No one tried to stop him as he moved through the museum, holding the precious papers. Once he was safely inside the secret room, he closed the door, placed the files on the floor, and collapsed onto the fur. He laid aside the first 3 files and opened the 4th one. Carefully, he slipped the receipt with the note about Kincaid's into his pocket. Ben continued to thumb through the rest of the file, past meaningless papers and ledgers, until a carbon copy of a letter caught his eye. It was an official-looking stationery from the museum. May 12, 1964. Dear Miss Wilson. Who's Miss Wilson? That's Ben's mom. I'm writing to you as an employee of the American Museum of Natural History in New York City. I have recently agreed to undertake an exciting assignment to create a new diorama based on the flora and fauna of the Gunflint Lake region of Minnesota. My colleagues and I plan to arrive in Minneapolis sometime in October, and then we'll travel by car up to the lake region, which I understand is about a 5-hour trip. Since you are the town librarian, I am reaching out to you, hoping you might be able to help us as we research all the elements needed for the creation of our diorama. We plan to spend about 2 months in Gunflint Lake to give us an adequate time to understand the land and the animals. It's our sincere wish to work with you. I'll be sketching and taking extensive photographs during the course of the entire trip. At the moment, we're also looking for places we can stay. Any suggestions you might have would be greatly appreciated. You can contact me at the address above. Thank you very much. Daniel Lobel, Exhibition Preparator, the American Museum of Natural History. Now remember, back in 1964, they didn't have email or text, so they had to mail this letter, and it had to get all the way from New York to Gunflint Lake, Minnesota. And so this back and forth would have taken a little bit of time. Okay, so this is back to Rose's story, but I want you to remember the planetarium that Jamie took Ben to. This is probably a similar picture of what they were looking at. And you see, I don't know, the moon here with all the stars around it. And it's a reflection in the car's window. And you see that Rose is resting peacefully on Walter's shoulder. You can tell that she feels comfortable with Walter. And here we have a picture of the moon. This is the city of New York. Back to Ben. Ben rushed to the museum until he arrived at the information desk on the entrance hall. He was sure his heart was going to come crashing through his chest. He ran to the front of the line and said breathlessly, "I'm looking for Daniel Lobel. He works here." The woman started speaking, but Ben interrupted her. "I need to find him right now. He's my dad." The woman's lips moved again. Ben thought she was asking him if he was lost. "Please just look him up." The woman seemed worried, and she glanced back at the long line of people waiting to ask her a question, then put on her glasses and pulled out a black book from one of the drawers in her desk. Stamped in white on the cover of the book were the words Museum Directory, 1976 to 1977. She flipped through the pages, brought the book closer to her face, and frowned. Then she turned to Ben and moved her mouth moved as she shook her head. "He's got to be there. Look him up again, please." The woman put her finger to her lips, and he knew he must have been speaking too loudly. She ran her finger down one of the pages and turned the book toward Ben. Showing him the names Liskey Catherine and Logan Michael, she tapped the names, indicating that his father's name would have been between them if he'd worked at the museum. Ben felt his whole body sag. The woman closed the book, picked up the phone, smiled in a strained way, and said something. Ben watched as she spoke into the phone, hung up, and raised one hand, indicating he should wait. Had she called someone who knew Daniel? Ben hopped from foot to foot, impatiently waiting as the woman turned to help other people in line. He watched the minutes tick by on a clock behind her desk. At last she nodded towards someone on the other side of the room. Ben spun around. To his horror, a guard was heading toward them. The woman must have called security. Ben ran into the crowd and disappeared back into the museum. His heart raced, his thoughts spun. Even if his dad didn't work at the museum anymore, surely someone here must remember him. Using Jamie's keys, he made his way back down to the workroom where he and Jamie had explored the night before. He pushed open the door that said, "Abandon all hope, ye who enter here." Inside, 2 young men were hunched over their desk. A young woman in the corner poured some kind of liquid into a mold. All 3 of them looked up when Ben entered the room. "I'm looking for Daniel Lobel," he said. "He used to work here. He made the wolf diorama." The 3 workers looked at one another and shook their heads. 2 of them started to speak at the same time. Ben tried to figure out what they were saying. One of the men got up and walked toward Ben. He couldn't read his lips, but he was sure he knew what he was saying. None of them knew his father. Before he could call security, Ben darted out of the room as fast as he could. Soon he found himself back at the wolf diorama, out of breath. He knelt down and stared into the wolf's eyes. They seemed to burn with secrets. Ben was sure he'd never know. He put his hand up against the sheet of glass that separated him from the running wolves. He pictured them leaping toward him through the glass and swallowing him whole. Ben didn't know how long he'd been there before he finally returned to the secret room. The files lay scattered across the floor. He read through them again and noticed that all the correspondences relating to his father stopped in 1969, and he figured that must have been when he left the museum. Ben ran his hands along the cluttered shelves, searching for a good place to store papers. For the first time, he noticed how fancy the shelves were, with all sorts of curly shapes and elaborate designs carved into the supports. Why would anyone decorate a storage room? All at once, Ben remembered the checkerboard pattern on the floor. He moved aside the caveman fur, grabbed an old piece of cloth, and rubbed away the dirt. More of the pattern appeared. It looked as if it had been painted to look like marble. Ben studied it and gazed again at the fancy shelves. The whole room started to feel oddly familiar. Ben hadn't been in this room for a few days now, but he realized he hadn't been looking at it. Behind the furniture, piled in the corner of the room, was a rectangular object about a foot taller than he was. It was covered in a tattered piece of fabric with a huge water stain. Ben walked over and moved the furniture aside. As he pulled off the cloth, a cloud of dust rose up and he coughed. Beneath the fabric was an old wood cabinet. The front was filled with little drawers and doors, each with a small picture on it. A few broken seashells and pieces of coral were attached to the top of the cabinet. Ben couldn't stop staring at it. His skin started buzzing again as he realized what he was looking at. The shelves, the floor, the cabinet, they were all exactly the same as the illustration he had seen in Wonderstruck. He was standing inside his father's book.
Interesting.
Back to Rose, and we see that they are inside an apartment with 2 lights on in the window. And there are 2 human figures, which we can infer would be Walter, the taller one, and Rose, the shorter one. As we see Rose with her hand on the window, and she's peering out the window, and she's got a happy face on, right? And we can see Walter's arm is kind of around her. And they're hugging probably before going to bed. What do we see here?
I was about to say, look at the picture.
Was this the same picture that is inside Rose's room in Hoboken? So there's a picture of Walter sitting and Rose is writing something, and it looks like she's writing "thank you." Walter, thank you, Walter, she says. And he wrote, "You're welcome, sister."
Sister?
Walter is her brother.
Her big brother.
Big brother. Come to her rescue. So, look what book he's reading. This says Wonderstruck on it. So this is Walter reading Wonderstruck. Probably not to Rose, but he's sitting next to the bed that she's sleeping in because, like, she can't hear it, so he wouldn't be reading to her. That'd be
Silly.
pointless. And in the picture of the book Wonderstruck, you see this very room that Rose was in earlier. It is the same room that Ben is describing in his story. And if you remember correctly, it is figure 26. We read about this earlier in part 1. Ben grabbed his copy of Wonderstruck and opened it to the illustration of the room. He looked from picture to the cabinet and found himself staring at the broken seashells on top of the old piece of furniture. The colors and the shapes reminded him of something, and he moved closer to inspect them. The illustration showed that this crown of shells and coral had once stood very tall. with all sorts of ornate decorations at the base that were drawn too small to see clearly. There was very little left on the top crown now. The dried cement still had a few shells stuck to it, though, and the indentations of other shells long lost could be seen like tiny fossils. Ben's gaze rested on one of the indentations. Slowly, as if underwater, he tucked the wonder-struck book into his back pocket, picked up the museum box, and opened it. He took out the seashell turtle and found the indentation on the cabinet again. Just as he suspected, the turtle fit perfectly, like the last piece in a mysterious puzzle he couldn't quite understand. How could this be? How could a tiny seashell turtle that was part of a museum exhibition in New York City decades ago make its way halfway across the country to his house in Minnesota? Ben tried to put it all together. Did the turtle once belong to his dad? Had he given it to his mom? Is that why she'd given it to Ben? What had his dad been doing in this room? And why had his mom kept so many secrets? The files Ben had stolen caught his eye, and he looked around for a place to store them. He opened the cabinet. It was empty. Carefully, he placed the papers inside, then lay down on the fur blanket. He only meant to rest for a moment, but before long, Ben was running desperately through the snow again. Someone grabbed his foot and Ben yelled, "Stop, Robbie!" He sat bolt upright and opened his eyes. It must have already been morning because there in front of him was Jamie carrying his green knapsack. What time was it? Ben shot a quick glance at the cabinet of wonders. Sitting on top was Ben's seashell turtle. As soon as he was able to think more clearly, Ben asked, "Did you call my aunt and uncle?" Jamie's eyes went wide like a deer caught in the headlights of an oncoming car. He mouthed the words, "I forgot." Relieved, Ben said, "It's okay, I'm not ready to leave." He was still dazed from everything he learned. He started telling Jamie about the wolf diorama and his dad, and how no one he talked to remembered him. Ben got more excited as he spoke, recounting each revelation and each disappointment. Jamie looked down and nodded absently. "Maybe your dad knows someone who remembers." Jamie picked up the notebook and wrote, "He's working." He must have looked disappointed because Jamie gave him a big smile as if to cheer him up. "I have a present for you." He reached into his knapsack and pulled out a large yellow book. The cover read, "Dictionary of American Sign Language, edited by Noah Fabricant and Lydia Del Ono, illustrated with over 250 drawings and indexed for easy cross-referencing. Learn sign language now." To be polite, Ben opened it. He stared at the tiny pen and ink drawings of hands and arms with arrows pointing up and down, forward and back. It looked like a book of codes. How could Ben ever learn them all? Anxiously, he flipped through the book. Midway through, he found the bookmark tucked between the pages. To his surprise, Jamie tried to grab it away. Thinking he was playing some kind of game, Ben snatched it back. Across the top it read, "Kincaid Books." It looked just like the other bookmark Ben had found. It had the same striped awning and the same books, the same cat, only the address was different. Ben looked at Jamie, confused. "Is there another Kincaid's?" Jamie didn't answer. Ben stared at the bookmark. "Jamie, the bookstore still exists?" Jamie had the most incomprehensible expression on his face. Why was he acting so strange? Why wouldn't he look at Ben? And then it dawned on him. "The other night I told you I was looking for Kincaid's. You told me it was closed." Jamie said nothing. "Why didn't you tell me it had just moved?" Finally, Jamie wrote, "I didn't know. I just found out yesterday." "You're lying to me." "I'm not." "Tell me the truth," Ben said. Jamie's hand shook as he wrote, "It's stupid." Ben pointed to the notebook, silently commanding Jamie to write more. "I was afraid if you found your father, he'd take you away and you wouldn't come anymore. And if you didn't find him, you'd go back to Gunflint Lake and I'd never see you again. But what did you think I was going to do? I can't live here forever." Ben saw Jamie mouth the words, I know. Then Jamie wrote, "I just wanted you to stay and be my friend." He rubbed his eyes and stared at the floor. Was Ben supposed to comfort Jamie, to tell him it was okay that he betrayed him? Didn't Jamie know that he wanted to be friends too? But wouldn't a true friend help him find his father? Jamie looked up, blinked a few times, and then wrote again. His face changed, and now he seemed quite determined, pressing the pen hard into the paper. "And just so you know, I did try to tell you the bookstore was still open. The first day I met you, I pointed in the direction of the new store, but you didn't listen and ran away. How was I supposed to know you were deaf?" Ben just stared at the words as if he could no longer understand their meaning. It felt like a hole had opened up in the floor and he'd slid through. In a daze, He took the notebook and pen, stood up, and walked to the cabinet. He grabbed the seashell turtle from his perch and stuffed it into his pocket along with the new bookmark. Then, without looking back, he headed for the door. And we're back to Rose. This is where we're going to stop right now. She is sleeping peacefully at Walter's apartment. For now, I need you to complete part 2 of the Wonderstruck summary. The somebody, the wanted, the conflict column, the so, and the then. And then I need you to write a summary of the text, including the details above.